The easing of the last glacial maximum, the end of the last ice age around 20,000 years ago, saw Homo sapiens begin to move away from predominantly hunter-gatherer lifestyles and to begin settling in large, more permanent communities. These warmer and more consistent climates reduced the need for groups to migrate annually alongside the animals they hunted, allowing communities to create permanent settlements, reducing the need to travel and saving precious calories. The Neolithic Revolution, roughly 8,000 years later, saw the formation of humanity's first cities, and with it the need for more sophisticated construction, agricultural and logistical techniques. The birth of written language and complex mathematics, for example, are not just beneficial byproducts of modern civilization, but the fundamental building blocks on which it's built. The birth of cities provided many benefits for early humans. Large settlements provided safety in numbers, and the ability to create a surplus of food to store for times that may have previously brought famine. This food surplus also crucially meant that not everyone had to account for their own sustenance. This allowed for the creation of specialised roles, such as craftspeople, to develop better tools for labourers, soldiers to develop the very land that sustained them, and of course administrators to oversee the distribution of resources and wealth. With the development of specialised roles came a more pronounced divide between the amount of resources available to different groups. Warriors, priests and administrators, among others, enjoyed higher pay and access to more resources than the less fortunate. As physical strength became more important for both cultivating and defending land, men began to decide that they were more worthy of resources than their female counterparts, birthing the patriarchal society that still oppresses women thousands of years later. As soon as someone finds themselves at an advantage within a society such as this, it's in their best interest to maintain, or ideally further, that advantage. One can do this by giving gifts to people of influence in order to gain favour, or by using their wealth to create more earning opportunities. If these efforts are fruitful, the extra wealth these endeavours create can be used to accrue even more power and wealth in the process. In short, the more wealth one has, the more money one may and indeed shall spend to maintain or further their position within the hierarchy. Someone heavily invested in this way of thinking could argue that it's inherently fair. Why, of course, everyone has the same opportunities, and it's only through their intelligent investment and skills that those individuals were able to gain power. But whatever your perspective on the system is, it's one that is inherently inefficient. As people gather more resources, they can and will spend more of those resources purely to maintain their own position. Resources that could instead be used to fix issues within the increasingly unequal society. It becomes even more concerning when we realise that there is good evidence that this ideology spreads like a virus. In 2011, Dr. Deborah Rogers published a paper discussing mathematical models produced to simulate both egalitarian and stratified or hierarchical societies. Through simulating these differing societal structures, Rogers noticed that stratified societies were fundamentally less stable than otherwise identical egalitarian ones. When Rogers changed the simulation to unevenly distribute the resources, the group was much more vulnerable to population crashes, an event in which the population loses at least 25% of its size in 1 year or successive years of population decline. Stratified populations were never able to stabilise, because the upper classes continued to thrive even as resources were being depleted and the population was headed for trouble. Population stability was significantly greater for egalitarian societies. However, when considering how these conclusions could apply in the real world, Rogers drew some grave conclusions. Rogers hypothesizes that hierarchical populations would eventually become unstable. When this happens in the real world, however, they're highly likely to migrate in search of resources. The inherent inefficiency of stratified societies leads to a resource crisis and the demand to expand beyond the population's boundaries. This is done in order to acquire more resources, but also has a secondary consequence of spreading the ideology further. The most vulnerable to this spread are the egalitarian societies that aren't susceptible to the same fundamental issues and have therefore not prioritised developing tools for expansion and defence, such as advanced weaponry and armed forces. Socioeconomic stratification may have spread across the globe over the past several thousand years, not because it provided apparent advantages that led to its adoption by egalitarian cultures, but simply because it altered demographic outcomes in a way that produced an increase in frequency of stratified populations. Through population expansion or outward migration of populations in search for additional territory and resources. In other words, the rapid worldwide adoption of hierarchical societies may not have been because it's the best solution. but because it's such a flawed system that it must continuously spread to stay alive, using resources and creating refugees in its wake, some of whom, in search for a solution for the problems that hierarchical societies cause them, spread it to otherwise uninfected societies. The idea does seem far-fetched at a glance, a naive, reductivist view of the development of modern societies, fit to be the essay subject of an opinionated 15-year-old wannabe anarchist, but I think it's worth considering, if only for the fact that, to assume that humans can only make technological progress in deeply hierarchical systems is to doom essentially all people within a rounding error to abject poverty in comparison to the resources available to the very few, and to deny ourselves the very attainable future of highly reduced poverty for vast majority of the world's population. In short, to assume that we need a company like Tesla to expand the horizon of human knowledge is to also doom potentially trillions of unborn humans to be ruled by someone like this. And just in case we want more for humanity than that, I think it behooves us to consider a world in which rampant resource inequality isn't a foregone conclusion. For the vast majority of England's history, inheritances were distributed according to male preference primogeniture, in which the eldest son inherited the whole estate, leaving any younger sons or daughters without. These less fortunate members of the aristocracy would be well aware of the luxury that so narrowly passed them by, and fueled by a sense of injustice, attempted to find a different route to their fortune. Through the 17th century, many of the first European colonizers of America would be second or third sons of wealthy families. Cast out by the inheritocracy that left them without any generational wealth, these men would take a life-threatening trip across the Atlantic Ocean in a search for the riches they felt they deserved, yet had been deprived of. Native American tribes would not be prepared for the greed and devastation that the vast wooden ships would bring. Genocide, the likes of which North American soil had never seen before, in the systematic murder and re-education of the predominantly egalitarian native societies. These communities had the inconvenient spiritual beliefs focused on worshipping and respecting the land, not wasting the resources it provided, as well as making sure that everyone within their communities was provided for equally. These beliefs, and the people who held them dearly, had to be removed from the land so the budding entrepreneurs could extract its plentiful wealth. The discovery of the New World became the impetus for not only the extermination of the Native American cultures, but also the formation of the triangle slave trade, the excuse many Europeans used to commit some of the worst acts humanity has ever inflicted upon itself. In an attempt to access goods from Asia at a lower price, fearful that the quality of life was lower than those of the Asian dynasties, the Europeans sank to new lows in the pursuit of resources, attacking and manipulating African and Southeast Asian communities, using fear and wealth to force people to turn against one another, and eventually imprisoning millions of people and creating a cultural and legal hierarchy that would affect billions over the next 300 years and into our future. Through European imperialism and the slave trade, we see the same extermination of egalitarian societies committed by the rejects of the hierarchical empires, possessing a type of greed akin to a religious fervour that could only be created when you see rampant resource inequality and feel like you deserve to be on top too. The glorification of these atrocities and the empires they formed created a dark miasma that would hang over the world for the following centuries and still lingers clearly today. With the wealth and respect that the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch and Belgians had generated through their barbaric exploits, those European countries who'd been unable to do the same felt that they had missed out on what they were owed by their empire. Once again, when resource distribution becomes unequal, it creates a chain reaction of greed that both spreads and deepens inequality, as well as increasing the human capability to hurt itself in the worst ways we know how. Karl May was born in 1842 in the Kingdom of Saxony before its unification with the German Empire in 1871. May would begin to train as a teacher, before being caught stealing 6 candles from the school. After appealing his expulsion, it was agreed that he would be transferred to a school in another city to complete his studies. The young Karl would graduate before, again, being accused of stealing, this time for taking his roommate's watch. With his hopes of becoming a teacher ruined, May left town to start his life as a con man. Like all self-respecting swindlers, Karl had a quiver of characters and tall tales that he used to steal people's cash. A favourite of May's was dressing up as a well-off doctor, checking into a hotel, running up a large tab ordering fur coats and precious metals to the room, before disappearing in the dead of night, having never paid his bill. Karl also had a police officer's outfit. Using this, he would go door to door, explaining to homeowners that there had been a spate of counterfeit currency in the area, and Karl was to check all of their large notes for authenticity. Naturally, all the notes would turn out to be fake, and Mai would walk away from people's houses with large bundles of cash. Mai's crimes would eventually catch up with him, and after escaping jail and hiding in the woods until he almost starved to death, Mai would spend 4 years in prison. During this time, he'd work as the prison librarian, reading stories of the Old West and editorialized accounts of Europeans exploring the New World. After Mai's release from prison, he decided to continue his life of fakery and deceit, claiming upon his return to his hometown that he'd spent the last 4 years traveling the Americas as well as Asia, using the information that he'd read in prison to create fanciful stories of his time as an explorer. In 1893, Karl May would release the first book in the Winterthur series, outlining the adventures of a young German frontiersman and May's namesake Karl, nicknamed Old Shatterhand, and his Apache blood brother Winterthur. To call these books the Harry Potter of their day would be an understatement. Today, May is the second most widely read author in Germany, only beaten out by Martin Luther, the author of the German translation of the Bible. Karl's work would quickly make him a household name in Germany, and it would be at the height of his fame that Karl would declare that all the stories were in fact true, and that he was Old Shatterhand. Karl worked hard to embody Old Shatterhand after this point, dressing in an exaggerated cowboy outfit he had made, and rarely being seen without upwards of 6 guns adorning his torso, each one more precariously holstered to the German man's chest than the last. The loss of World War I came as a shock to many of the German people. Early wins on the battlefield and technological advancements gave the country a sense that victory was imminent. Alongside this, state media had a tendency to hide military failings from the public, creating a false sense that the German Empire was winning. This left Germans with a feeling that victory had been snatched away from them by overly cautious leaders. The choice to surrender was not seen as a merciful one from the German officers, but instead a weakness, a failure to believe in the success of the German populace. Many soldiers were reportedly angered when they were told to stand down, not knowing how close the impending defeat was. Experiencing loss on the global stage, hyperinflation, and watching comparable European powers such as Britain, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands and France amass great wealth by colonizing the Americas, Africa, and Asia, left millions of Germans with a sense that they had been slighted, missing out on the colonial gold rush while the rest of Europe was in a moral race to the bottom, committing horrific acts to gain a stranglehold on the trade of exotic goods in the continent. For a generation of young Germans, born too late to have a say in the decisions that created their circumstance, May's novels of unbridled adventure and victory over less technologically advanced groups was not only enthralling, but inspirational. One boy for whom this was truer than most was one Adolf Hitler, who would later claim that reading Karl May late into the night had caused his grades to drop. Less than 20 years later, in a private, recorded meeting, Hitler would explain just how pivotal May was to his worldview. I've just been reading a very fine article on Karl May. I found it delightful. It would be nice if his work were republished. I owe him many of my first notions of geography and the fact that he opened my eyes on the world. As Hitler consolidated power, he would use the ideas outlined by May and the real American frontiersman as justification for his concept of Lebensraum, Germany's answer to manifest destiny. Hitler was vocal about his beliefs in the concept of social Darwinism, the idea that stronger societies can and will overtake weaker societies. The struggle we are waging against the Soviet partisans resembles very much the struggle in North America against the Red Indians. Victory will go to the strong and strength is on our side. It would be a German people, fueled by indignation due to the outcomes of the Great War, and an insatiable wanderlust inspired by stories of Old Shatterhand that Hitler would preach to. These ever-increasing crowds would resonate with the same desire for expansion and exploration that May had ignited in them some years ago. May would remain an essential part of Hitler's philosophy until his death. Within the study of his mountain retreat, the Berghof, Hitler kept a complete set of May's 60-plus works, which he reread in its entirety between 1933 and 1934. May was considered by Hitler to be an essential reading for all competent Nazi soldiers. As Nazis began to lose momentum on the Eastern Front, Hitler ordered 300,000 copies of May's work to be sent to officers on the front lines. In Hitler's estimation, the tactical prowess of Old Shatterhand would provide Nazi officers with inspiration and cunning needed to defeat the Soviets. The Nazi dictator would continue to obsess over May until his death, running a military operation inspired by the Winterthur book series just 8 days before his suicide, as Soviet soldiers steadily crept into Berlin. The influence of American and European colonialism on not just Hitler but a generation of disenfranchised and underprivileged youth fertilized the soil in which Nazism was able to grow. The precedents set by other global powers left Germany with an unavoidable sense of injustice, a feeling not unlike the second sons of Europe, who thought they were deserving of what their peers had, and it was just their right to take it. Looking at the last 300 years, we see not just two horrific European wars, but the consequences of European aristocracy, the refugees it created, and the ability for those refugees to cement inequality into the foundations of the societies they create. We also see the glorification of the American frontier, rebranding genocide as exploration, and plastering over the unavoidably ugly details with showbiz, historical fantasy, and Italian men in dark face paint. These fantasies, through Karl May, infected a generation of Germans with a desire to themselves be Old Shatterhand. And when they saw everyone else in Europe getting rich when they starved, they were more than ready to listen to a man tell them exactly who they should blame for everything they thought was wrong. The direct line that can be drawn from the hierarchical British Empire to the American colonialists and later to right-wing authoritarianism in Germany is, I think, the best evidence for the infectious nature of inequality. Moving like a virus, slowly transforming to best suit its host, while it spreads to all they contact. Susceptibility to the virus can worsen when people feel like they aren't getting what they deserve, what their society and their culture says they should have. In these situations, people are more likely to look for a scapegoat and resort to sailing to a foreign land, committing atrocities in the name of expansion, or cable tying a flag to a lamppost. If we're to consider inequality to be some sort of ideological infection, it may not give us the tools to wipe it out entirely, but it could help us understand how we are personally at risk of being tricked into spreading it. Here in the UK, we're particularly vulnerable right now, as the cost of basic goods and services continues to rise. For the vast majority of people, it's become increasingly hard to make ends meet. This, as we have seen, creates a tension between the life you expect to have in a developed country and the reality of our existence. So how does this tension manifest in the cultural conversation? Is it frustration that food prices continue to rise while Tesco's enjoys record profits? Is it anger fueled by national pride that a South African billionaire is attempting to buy our elections, now trillionaire at the time of recording? Is it rage that a large percentage of private broadcasting in the UK is now owned by one company? No, it's immigration, at least according to those who stand to profit from you thinking that. History shows us that when inequality worsens, the people at the top convince the general populace to look down to find their scapegoat and not up. If there is any way that we could fight this infection, to stop it ravaging our communities, consuming our resources, and moving on to a new host when we have no more to give, it's this. When someone who has more than you tries to tell you who to blame for your circumstance, consider if they may have a vested interest, and if they are in fact enlisting you to spread their propaganda to maintain the status quo they profit from. Because, at the heart of it, when we boil everything else away, deep down, they're just terrified that one day they may end up just like me or you.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down.